In August of 2024, Megan Ellis, a 22-year-old college senior from Denver, set off alone on what was supposed to be a short but soul-stirring adventure in Grand Teton National Park, her heart brimming with the excitement of conquering the trails she had studied on maps for weeks. She had always loved the outdoors, often calling the mountains her second classroom, a place where she learned about herself more than any lecture hall could offer. And with her phone in hand, she sent her mother, Donna Ellis, a cheerful selfie at the trailhead, her face flushed with anticipation and framed by the grandeur of the peaks that stood like sentinels above her. Donna smiled when the photo arrived, answering with a quick message telling her daughter to be safe and to text her when she returned. But that text would become the last proof of Megan's existence before silence swallowed her. Hours turned into a long night, and when Megan failed to return or answer her phone, unease tightened its grip on Donna until the next morning when panic fully set in, propelling her to contact authorities. Rangers moved swiftly, tracing her path from the gravel parking lot where her car still sat, locked and untouched. The windows clouded from the night's cool air, to the start of the trail where footprints faded into nothingness among pine needles and stone. Volunteers, bloodhounds, and even helicopters scoured the vast rugged terrain, voices calling her name, echoing against cliffs that gave back only their own hollowness, as though the mountain itself were hiding her secret. By evening, searchers uncovered her empty water bottle near a bend in the river, a sign that she had been there, yet no further tracks could be found, leaving everyone unsettled by how swiftly her trail had vanished. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some whispered of an animal attack, others of a fall into one of the park's unforgiving crevices, while a few darker voices suggested she may have wanted to disappear. But Donna rejected every theory that suggested her daughter had walked willingly into oblivion. Megan was too bright, too full of plans for the future to vanish by choice. Each night that followed, Donna replayed the last photo in her mind. Megan's smile, her confident stance with the jagged skyline behind her, and the weight of that image became both her comfort and her torment. With no answers, only questions, and with the official search already thinning as days passed, Donna clung to the unshakable conviction that her daughter was still somewhere out there, waiting to be found, her absence gnawing at the edges of every sunrise and every sleepless night. For days the Tetons were alive with the hum of helicopters circling above jagged ridges and valleys, their searchlights cutting across the granite faces like restless eyes, while search dogs pressed their noses to the soil, tracing scents that vanished as quickly as they appeared. And hundreds of volunteers tramped through thick underbrush, shouting Megan Ellis's name into the indifferent wilderness. The sound of boots on loose shale and the crack of branches became the chorus of desperation, each echo swallowed by the immense silence of Wyoming's peaks that seemed to guard their secrets jealously, as if the mountain itself had conspired to hide the young woman who had once stood at its feet with a smile. On the third day, a park ranger waded into the shallows of a river bend and spotted something half buried under wet leaves and silt. Megan's backpack, mud-streaked and unzipped, its straps frayed from dragging against stone. Inside, searchers found her half-empty water flask, a granola bar still wrapped, and her journal, pages warped from damp but blank, no message scrawled to explain her sudden vanishing. This discovery fueled theories that clashed and tangled among officials, some whispering of a mountain lion dragging her into the timberline, others fearing she had slipped on rock and been swept away by the river's current, while a darker undercurrent suggested she may have chosen to vanish deliberately, carried by a desire to escape pressures no one had seen coming. Reporters swarmed Jackson Hole, filing stories that painted her as everything from a lost free spirit to a tragic accident. But Donna Ellis sat in the cabin she rented, clutching her daughter's photo against her chest and shaking her head each time a new report aired. To her, Megan was not a mystery to be packaged into theories, but her child, her only daughter, and she could not believe that a girl who had laughed over coffee the week before and mapped out plans for graduate school had suddenly chosen oblivion. Each morning Donna joined the search, her feet blistered from miles of trails, her hands raw from pulling back brambles as she called into the wind, her voice ragged but unbroken. At night, she stood at the cabin window, watching the silhouettes of mountains vanish into shadow, whispering prayers into the dark, as though the peaks themselves might one day whisper back the truth. The world was ready to close the case, but Donna refused to surrender to silence, vowing that until her last breath, she would fight against the emptiness that had swallowed her daughter whole. Donna Ellis remained in Jackson Hole long after the news crews packed up their vans, and the official search dwindled to a handful of tired rangers walking familiar trails, her determination rooted like the pines that clung stubbornly to the mountain slopes. She rented a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, its wood-paneled walls cold in winter and stifling in summer, yet it became her sanctuary and her prison, filled with maps she pinned to the walls and a corkboard covered with photographs, phone numbers, and scraps of information that might lead her back to her daughter. Each morning she walked into town, carrying a stack of flyers, taping them to lampposts, grocery store bulletin boards, and the walls of coffee shops, her hands trembling but her resolve steady as strangers glanced with pity at the photo of Megan smiling in her red jacket. At press conferences, Donna spoke with a voice both raw and steady, urging officials not to let her daughter become another forgotten case, her words echoing against the microphones as reporters scribbled their notes, though she could see in their eyes how quickly they would move on to the next headline. At night, when the world grew still and the quiet pressed against her chest, Donna sat alone in her cabin, phone in hand, staring at Megan's last selfie until her vision blurred with tears. She whispered into the darkness promises that bordered on prayers, telling her daughter she would never give up, that no matter how many seasons passed, she would remain in these mountains until she had answers. 11 months slipped by, like shadows stretching across the valley. The days marked not by progress but by silence, each passing one another cruel reminder of how the case had gone cold, the ranger station growing less hopeful, the detectives turning their attention elsewhere. Locals in town began to recognize her not as a visitor but as a fixture. The woman who always asked questions, who always carried that photograph, who always walked with the weight of a missing child pressing against her spine. Friends back in Denver begged her to return, to find some semblance of a normal life, but Donna could not imagine leaving, for leaving felt like surrender, and surrender was something she had sworn never to allow. The cabin's walls bore witness to her grief and her defiance, and the mountains outside, vast and immovable, became both her tormentors and her confidants, as she anchored herself to the unshakable belief that Megan was still out there waiting to be found. In July of 2025, Ranger Kyle Mercer, a 38-year-old veteran of Grand Teton's rugged backcountry, trudged along a restricted ridge few hikers ever saw, his boots scraping against limestone as the wind curled around the cliffs with a mournful whistle, when a sudden glint of color caught his eye high above. Perched in the skeletal branches of an enormous eagle's nest clinging to the face of a cliff, there was something that did not belong among the twigs and weathered bones of prey, something that shimmered briefly against the sunlight before disappearing into shadow again. Raising his binoculars, Kyle steadied his hands, his heart quickening as the image sharpened, and there it was, unmistakable even through dirt and fray, a torn scrap of bright red fabric entangled in the woven sticks, its edges fluttering like a trapped heartbeat with each gust. He froze, knowing in an instant what that color represented, for it was the same vivid red jacket that had filled the missing posters for nearly a year, the same jacket that Megan Ellis had been last seen wearing the morning she vanished. Kyle lowered the binoculars, his breath shallow, his mind racing through protocol and instinct, for this ridge was miles away from her last known location, and the discovery suggested she had wandered or been taken. Far off the mapped trails, into places no search parties had reached. Carefully, he scanned the nest again, noticing that the fabric was not alone, that small strands of hair were tangled in the twigs, and something else glimmered faintly, metallic and unfamiliar, as though the eagle had gathered remnants of a human life alongside branches and feathers. Kyle reached for his radio, pressing the button with fingers that trembled despite his training, his voice steady but urgent as he reported the finding to the ranger station, aware that he had just reignited a case thought to be fading into memory. Far below in the valley, life carried on as tourists snapped photos and families wandered the safe trails, unaware that high above them the mountain had revealed its first secret in nearly 11 months, one that could unravel the silence that had suffocated Donna Ellis's heart. Kyle stood there a moment longer, staring at the nest, the torn red fabric twisting in the wind like a signal flag, and he felt the strange weight of being the first to glimpse the ghost of a girl who had never truly left these peaks, her presence lingering in the talons of the wild. Kyle's voice crackled through the radio, low but urgent, each word steady as he described the discovery high in the eagle's nest, his report cutting through the static and landing heavy in the ears of the investigators who had nearly given up hope after months of silence. The detail chilled them immediately, for the location of the nest was not near the trailhead where Megan Ellis had last been seen, but miles away across rugged ridges and ravines, terrain so unforgiving that even the most determined search teams had avoided venturing too deep into it. The very idea that her jacket, or at least the torn remnants of it, had surfaced in such an unreachable place stirred both dread and possibility. As though the mountain had been keeping a secret it had only now decided to relinquish. At the ranger station, phones rang and footsteps echoed in hurried rhythm. Files once gathering dust were pulled out, and faces that had grown resigned with time suddenly carried a flicker of urgency again. When Donna Ellis received the call, she was in her small cabin, folding the same flyers she had been posting for months, her weary hands pausing mid-crease as the voice on the other end told her a clue had been found. The words seemed to come from another world, and for a moment she could not breathe, could not move, until her body began trembling with the weight of a hope she had both craved and feared. She grabbed her coat, barely remembering to lock the cabin door as she rushed into the cool air, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible down the narrow gravel road toward town, her mind racing with questions she could not yet ask. At the station, rangers stood gathered, their faces grave but alert, and Donna entered with eyes wide and heart pounding, desperate for any scrap of detail. They told her about the nest, about the red fabric, about the strange, cruel irony of an eagle preserving what the earth had almost swallowed. Her fingers dug into the counter as though steadying herself against the force of those words, her voice cracking as she asked to see the evidence, to touch it, to confirm with her own hands what they had found. Nearly a year had passed since Megan vanished, nearly a year of searching, begging and waiting, and now, for the first time, the silence of the mountains had been broken. The retrieval began at dawn, when a team of climbers equipped with ropes and harnesses edged their way up the cliff face, their breaths visible in the crisp mountain air as the valley below filled with the hush of onlookers waiting for what might be uncovered. The eagle circled overhead in restless arcs, its cries sharp and accusatory, as if aware that humans were intruding upon its fortress built of twigs and bone. But the climbers pressed on, their gloved hands steady as they reached the enormous nest that clung stubbornly to the rock. With care, they pulled free the fragments hidden inside, lifting out the bright red fabric, that once had been whole and warm upon Megan Ellis's shoulders, now torn and weathered by months of exposure, its color faded but still unmistakable. They found strands of hair tangled in the sticks, fragile reminders that a living body had once been near, and then, tucked deep within the woven branches, a small notebook, its cover warped and pages swollen with water damage. A broken pen still tucked inside, as though Megan had tried to write until the very end. When the climbers descended with their finds, the objects were laid gently upon a table at the ranger station, and Donna Ellis was called forward, her steps hesitant as though each one carried the weight of a lifetime. She reached out with trembling fingers, touching the jacket fragment first, her breath catching as the fabric slid against her skin, both foreign and achingly familiar. She lifted the strands of hair next, her hand shaking so violently that one ranger steadied her elbow, and then, with a reverence that bordered on prayer, she cradled the notebook against her chest. The pen was still clipped there, its metal rusted, its purpose silenced. But to Donna it felt like a message, a sign that her daughter had fought to leave something behind, however incomplete. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered Megan's name again and again, her heart splitting open under the cruel balance of grief and hope. For in these fragile remains lay both confirmation of suffering and the faint possibility of answers. Around her, investigators moved with hushed urgency, photographing, bagging, and cataloguing each piece. But Donna heard none of it, for she was lost in the storm of memory and longing, holding on to the relics of a daughter whose story was finally beginning to surface from the silence of the mountains. The notebook was delivered to the forensics lab, with the same care one might give to a sacred relic, its waterlogged pages handled only with gloves and precision tools, every inch of it photographed and preserved, before specialists began the painstaking process of drying and recovering the faint smudges of ink that time and weather had tried to erase. For hours they bent over the fragile sheets, using filtered lights and digital enhancements to bring back words that seemed to rise like ghosts from the paper, fragments of thoughts Megan Ellis had managed to scribble in moments of solitude during her final days. The first entries spoke of exhaustion and determination, her excitement for the mountain still evident in her handwriting. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted, the words tightening into hurried scrawls of unease, her lines fractured with fear that seeped through every sentence. She described a presence that lingered too close, a sense of being followed along the winding trails where few hikers ventured, noting the sound of boots crunching on loose gravel behind her at night, heavier than any animal, deliberate and paced as though measuring each of her own steps. She wrote of waking from shallow sleep beneath her tarp to the feeling of eyes upon her, of hearing a cough once in the darkness and convincing herself it was the wind until the noise came again, unmistakably human. Her entries grew more fragmented, spelling errors smearing across the damp paper, as if she had been writing by flashlight with hands shaking too much to control the pen. Then came the final page, its ink blurred and trailing into nothing, beginning with words that cut Donna Ellis to her core when she was allowed to read them under supervision. "He's closer tonight. I can hear him," and then the sentence broke off, the pen gouging slightly into the softened paper before ceasing altogether. The investigators stared at the unfinished thought as though it were a wound that would never close, evidence of terror that could not be mistaken for imagination. Donna clutched the photocopies of those words to her chest, her tears soaking through the edges, as she whispered that her daughter had been right, that she had not simply lost her way or fallen to nature, but had sensed something far darker closing in on her. The notebook became both evidence and testament, the voice of a young woman echoing from the grave silence of the Tetons, refusing to be forgotten. The discovery of Megan's notebook shifted the investigation into a sharper light, and as investigators pored over the fragments of her words, Their focus began to settle on a name that had floated uneasily through whispers in the community for months. Ethan Ward, a 27-year-old seasonal worker who had been stationed in Grand Teton during the week of Megan's disappearance. Ethan had drifted from job to job, picking up work at campgrounds, trailheads and maintenance crews, never staying long enough to be rooted, yet always leaving behind the faint shadow of unease, especially among women who crossed his path. Records showed that multiple female hikers had filed informal complaints about him, noting his tendency to linger around campsites long after dark, to follow them at a distance on trails, his gaze fixed and unsettling, his presence cloaked in a silence too deliberate to be innocent. Though no charges had ever stuck, the pattern painted him as a man whose interest in the park was less about the landscape and more about the vulnerable figures who wandered through it. Locals recalled his erratic moods, the way he could be helpful one moment, offering to carry supplies, and then unnervingly intense the next, staring at campers as though memorizing their routines. In hindsight, his fascination with watching others seemed less like idle curiosity and more like a hunter learning the movements of prey. What unsettled investigators most was his abrupt disappearance from the area just days after Megan vanished. His contract left unfinished, his final paycheck unclaimed at the ranger office, as though he had slipped out under cover of silence. Former co-workers described him as restless in those final days, pacing the grounds with eyes darting, chewing at his nails until they bled, muttering to himself in tones no one could understand. His sudden absence had been noted but dismissed at the time, chalked up to another drifter unable to commit. Yet, in the shadow of Megan's words about the sound of boots behind her, Ethan's profile began to fit too well. When Donna Ellis was told of him, her stomach clenched, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and dread, for she felt certain this was the figure her daughter had sensed stalking the trails. In the quiet of her cabin, she repeated his name like a curse, knowing that if Megan's story had been preserved in fragments, Ethan Ward might hold the rest of it, hidden within the darkness he carried from ridge to ridge. When investigators pressed deeper into the fragments of Megan's notebook and the troubling history of Ethan Ward, Ranger Kyle Mercer remembered a detail that had nagged at him for months, a shadow of memory that only now took shape. In late August of the year, Megan vanished. He had seen Ethan near the very ridge where the eagle's nest had recently given up its secrets, standing alone with his pack slung low, staring across the valley in a way that struck Kyle as watchful rather than contemplative. That recollection added weight to the suspicions, and soon a team was dispatched across state lines to Idaho, where Ethan had resurfaced in a small town, working odd jobs at a repair shop and sleeping in the back of his truck. When detectives approached, Ethan was cordial at first, smiling too wide, his words running ahead of him as if rehearsed, insisting he had left Wyoming because the seasonal work had dried up, insisting too that he had never heard of Megan Ellis beyond the news reports that everyone else had seen. Yet, in the interrogation room, the pressure began to peel away his composure. His eyes darted, his foot tapped an uneven rhythm against the floor, and sweat beaded along his brow though the air conditioner hummed steadily above. When they asked if he had ever hiked the ridge where the eagle's nest was perched, he shrugged, deflecting, saying he hardly knew the back country, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The detectives laid out the fragment of red fabric on the table, describing how it had been preserved in the nest, and casually asked if he remembered seeing Megan's jacket before she vanished. Ethan's head snapped up too quickly, denial tumbling from his lips in a rush, yet his next words trapped him. That jacket was too bright. She should have. He cut himself off, his throat tightening as silence swallowed the room. But the damage was done, for he had spoken of details never shared publicly. One detective leaned forward, voice low but steady. asking what exactly he meant. And Ethan's hands began to shake violently as he whispered, almost to himself, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." His voice cracked on the final word, a confession that was less about facts than about guilt surfacing in fragments, and though he quickly tried to retreat into silence, the truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable and damning, a shadow of his own making that he could no longer outrun. The breakthrough came when investigators, guided by Ethan Ward's vague admissions and Ranger Kyle Mercer's recollections, pushed farther into the backcountry than they ever had before, combing through a maze of ridges and timber where few ventured, until they stumbled upon the remnants of a hidden camp tucked beneath a canopy of spruce, its ashes long cold, but the ground around it whispering of secrets buried in haste. The search team fanned out, their boots pressing into damp earth, probing with shovels and gloved hands, until one ranger's blade struck against something solid beneath a layer of pine needles and loose soil, a hollow thud that stilled the air. They crouched down, brushing away dirt, and what emerged was a shallow pit where objects had been hastily concealed, each one carrying the unmistakable weight of a life interrupted. First came a pair of hiking boots, mud-caked but intact, their size and brand matching the very ones Megan Ellis had been wearing when she set off on the trail 11 months earlier. Beside them lay a pocket knife, its blade rusted from exposure yet bearing scratches along the handle that spoke of long use, the initials faint but present, confirming it had been Megan's, a gift from her uncle years before. And then, as silence tightened around the group, a small plastic rectangle was lifted from the soil, its edges warped, but the photograph still visible. A student ID card bearing Megan's face, smiling, frozen in the innocence of a year that no longer existed. The evidence was undeniable, a grim confirmation that foul play had woven itself into the story that Donna Ellis had feared yet resisted believing for so long. Back at the ranger station, when the news was relayed to her, Donna's knees buckled and she collapsed into a chair, her sobs filling the room, the sound raw and unrestrained, for it was as though every sleepless night and every unanswered prayer had erupted at once. Yet beneath the grief, a strange current of relief threaded through her. A release that came not from joy but from knowing the void had begun to yield its truth, that Megan had not simply vanished into myth, but had been taken, her story carved into the cruel hands of another. Donna pressed her daughter's ID against her chest when they placed it in her hands, whispering through tears that the truth, however painful, was finally surfacing, and with it came the fragile beginnings of justice. The courthouse in Jackson Hole became the reluctant stage for what the press swiftly christened the Eagle's Nest case. Its steps crowded each morning with reporters whose cameras flashed like lightning against the grey stone, as though they might capture the very truth through sheer persistence. Inside, the air was thick with tension, a silence that settled between each scrape of a chair and shuffle of a paper, as Ethan Ward sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn, the weight of the charges pressing down on him even as he avoided every eye that turned his way. He had been indicted for second-degree murder, the state acknowledging the absence of Megan Ellis's body, but arguing that the evidence, from the red jacket fragment to the buried boots and her student ID, wove together a picture of deliberate violence that could not be ignored. Donna Ellis occupied the front row of the gallery at every hearing, her hands clasped around the weather-worn notebook that had been lifted from the eagle's nest, holding it against her chest as though it were scripture, as though the faded ink of her daughter's final words could steady her trembling spirit. Her face was a portrait of endurance, lined with grief yet illuminated by an unwavering determination, and whenever the prosecutor spoke Megan's name, Donna closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, a ritual that became as much a part of the proceedings as the arguments themselves. Outside, the story spread across the nation, drawing strangers into Donna's fight, their voices rising on social media and in headlines. The phrase, "the Eagle's Nest case," repeated so often it began to feel like a legend carved out of the mountains themselves. Yet within those walls, where justice was wrestled over with evidence and testimony, the pain was far from myth. Former co-workers of Ethan testified about his unsettling habits, women recounted encounters that had left them shaken, and rangers described the hidden camp where Megan's belongings were unearthed. Each revelation was another needle in Donna's chest, yet she sat tall, her grip never loosening from the notebook that had preserved her daughter's voice. The defense tried to argue coincidence, to paint Ethan as a scapegoat for a tragedy born of wilderness. But when the jury's eyes lingered on Megan's photograph projected across the courtroom, it was clear the human weight of the evidence carried far more than technicalities. As the days unfolded, the courthouse became less a place of law and more a shrine of memory, where one mother's persistence refused to let her daughter fade into silence. When Donna Ellis took the stand, the courtroom fell into a silence so profound it seemed the very air held its breath. And as she adjusted the microphone with trembling hands, she carried with her not only the weight of her daughter's memory, but the ache of every sleepless night spent searching for meaning in absence. She began softly, her voice wavering at first as she described the last text Megan had sent on that August morning, a cheerful message punctuated by a selfie at the trailhead, a photograph that seemed so ordinary at the time, yet had become the last living proof of her daughter's existence. Donna spoke of Megan's dreams, how she had planned to graduate the following spring, her excitement about applying to graduate school, her constant eagerness to prove that the mountains she loved so deeply could be both a place of challenge and renewal. As Donna's words unfolded, she painted not only a portrait of a young woman with promise, but also of the whole left behind, an absence that echoed through her home, her church, her friendships, and most of all, her heart. She told the jury how she had refused to let the world forget her child, how she had stood on street corners in the biting cold, passing out flyers, how she had spoken to anyone who would listen, her voice hoarse, but her will unbroken. Her testimony was not polished like a lawyer's argument, but raw and human, spilling with the kind of truth that cannot be rehearsed. And as she reached for the Eagle's Nest notebook, holding it aloft with care, she explained how its pages contained the final fragments of her daughter's voice, words that testified to fear, to danger, to the sense of being hunted. Her voice cracked as she read aloud the line about boots crunching too heavy to be an animal. And in that moment, the courtroom broke, the reporters lowering their pens, the prosecutor bowing his head, even hardened, jurors lifting their hands to wipe at tears they could not conceal. It was not only grief they felt, but the undeniable presence of Megan, her spirit pressing against the sterile walls, until she was no longer a name in a file, but a living memory whose story demanded justice. Donna ended by whispering that Megan had deserved so much more, and when she stepped down from the stand, the jury's faces told the world they had been moved beyond words. The jury deliberated for days, their seclusion heavy with the burden of deciding a man's fate, while the echoes of testimony lingered in their minds, from the forensic details to the trembling words of a mother who refused to let her daughter's memory be erased. When at last the foreman rose in the hushed courtroom and delivered the single word, "guilty," the air cracked with the weight of it, and a tremor of release passed through the room, as though every soul had been holding the same breath. Ethan Ward sat motionless, his expression blank, yet his hands betrayed him, twitching against the table as if his body recognized what his mind refused to accept. The judge's voice carried solemn authority as he pronounced a 40-year sentence. The clang of justice, striking like a hammer against stone, binding Ethan to the consequence of a crime he had tried to bury in the wilderness. Donna Ellis gripped the edge of the bench in front of her, her whole body shaking with a surge of vindication so fierce it nearly lifted her from her seat. For at last, someone had named the guilt, had put into words what she had known from the moment she read her daughter's last unfinished page. Yet within that swell of triumph came the familiar crushing weight. The unmovable truth that Megan's body had never been recovered and perhaps never would be, that the mountains still held her in silence, her final resting place hidden beyond reach. Reporters poured out of the courthouse to broadcast the verdict, their headlines already framing it as the end of the Eagle's Nest case. But inside, Donna sat still, her tears streaming as she clutched the weathered notebook, whispering that it was not an end but only another step in a journey she had never chosen. Around her, people wept quietly. Strangers moved by her endurance. Jurors bowing their heads in respect as though to say they understood that justice, while powerful, could never replace what had been taken. Ethan was led away in chains, the sound of metal against the floor echoing through the hall like the closing of a chapter, but Donna's gaze was not on him. It was on the empty space beside her, the place where her daughter should have been, and though justice had spoken, the silence of that absence roared louder than any sentence could ever quiet. The summer sun hung low as Donna Ellis followed Ranger Kyle Mercer up the familiar ridge, each step heavy with memory, yet guided by a purpose she had carried since the verdict, her breath rising in thin clouds, despite the warmth of the day, the mountains stretching around them like solemn witnesses. The climb was slower now, her body weakened by grief and time, but Kyle stayed close, steadying her when the path grew steep, their silence companionable, a language of endurance spoken without words. When they reached the cliff where the eagle's nest still clung to the rock, the wind swept hard across the ridge, carrying with it the cries of the birds that circled high above, their wings glinting against the light as if the sky itself were blessing the moment. From the small satchel slung across her shoulder, Donna drew out a bundle of wildflowers she had gathered that morning from the valley floor, their colors bright and tender against the harsh gray of the stone, and with trembling hands she began to scatter the petals along the ridge, watching as they caught in the breeze and drifted outward, some falling into the abyss, others curling into the nest itself. Her eyes followed each petal as though it were a fragment of her daughter, carried away by the wind, freed at last from the silence that had held her captive for nearly a year. Kyle stood a step behind, his hat pressed to his chest, giving her the space of a mourner at an altar, his own eyes damp though he said nothing. Donna whispered into the air, her voice breaking but steady enough to carry, "You're free now, my girl." And the words seemed to rise with the wind, entwining with the cries of the eagles, until they became part of the landscape itself. She closed her eyes and imagined Megan's laughter echoing through the canyons, the sound blending with the rustle of wings and the rush of air, and for a moment she felt the unbearable weight of her grief shift into something lighter, something closer to peace. The petals continued to fall, marking the ridge with color that would soon fade, yet in that instant they became more enduring than stone, a mother's offering laid at the threshold of the sky. As they turned to leave, the mountains seemed less cruel, the silence less empty, for Donna carried with her the certainty that her daughter's spirit was no longer lost but soaring. At the Grand Teton Visitor Center, where travelers gathered before venturing into the sprawling wilderness, a new plaque was installed along the stone wall that bore the names of those who had been lost to the mountains, and among them shone a name that had come to symbolize both tragedy and defiance. Megan Ellis. The plaque was simple, her photograph etched beside words chosen by her mother, words that spoke not of how she had vanished, but of the light she carried in her short life and the strength she inspired even in death. Visitors paused before it, some bowing their heads, others tracing her name with their fingers. and Donna Ellis often stood at a distance, watching strangers who had never known her daughter pause long enough to remember her. Yet her mission did not end with a plaque, for Donna poured her grief into action, founding the Megan Ellis Foundation, an organization devoted to supporting families of missing hikers, funding search operations, and providing the tools and training that might one day spare others from her pain. Her daughter's name became a banner of perseverance, appearing on flyers, websites, and fundraising campaigns, and through it Donna found a way to channel the endless ache into something that reached beyond her own sorrow. In interviews, she spoke softly but firmly, telling audiences that the mountains could be cruel but that they also taught resilience. And she refused to let Megan's story fade into a cautionary tale alone. For Donna, her daughter was not simply a victim but a symbol of endurance, her memory woven into each effort to bring another hiker home. When at last she prepared to leave the mountains, after nearly a year of living in their shadow, she paused on the ridge road one final time, her gaze lifting to the sky where eagles traced wide circles above the peaks, their wings steady against the horizon. It was those very creatures, fierce and untamed, that had delivered her the fragments of truth, carrying the remnants of Megan's life into the open when the earth itself had tried to keep them hidden. Donna stood still, her hand pressed against her heart, whispering a silent thank you into the wind. And as the birds soared higher, she felt an almost sacred connection between the wild and the human, as though Megan's spirit had been folded into the flight. With tears that were softer now, she turned away, carrying her daughter's legacy forward into a world that would never again forget her name.